you think of Mortal Kombat games, you probably think of this style of gameplay, right? They're classic fighting games, if just for the controversy that they created. All the blood, gore, and decapitations kind of pissed off parents, but of course the kids playing the games were hooked into them for that very reason. Of course, due to the extreme success of the game, a few attempted spin-offs were created, such as the sucktastic Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. Granted, I never actually played the game, but I've read enough articles and watched videos on it, and I wasn't impressed. Gotta hand it to Midway though. They at least attempted something different, and they kept trying it. It took a few games, but they finally had something with Shaolin Monks, a 3D beat 'em up that takes everything you know about Mortal Kombat and ties it into an action game. The game opens up with a fighting scene that's pretty much happens between the first and second games. It's an awesome intro, and is worth looking up on YouTube just to see this. The combatants are suckered into the basement of the island where the competition takes place, and this is where the game begins. We have an initial selection of only Liu Kang or Kung Lao, and sadly there's only two other fighters that you can take into the main campaign with you. Finishing the game as Kung Lao unlocks Sub-Zero, and doing so with Liu Kang unlocks Scorpion. Both Scorpion and Sub-Zero have a shortened move list, but it's a nice change of pace to fight as those two. Don't be too discouraged just because your favorite fighter might not be included in the campaign. Chances are, there will be a cameo somewhere, and a few other fighters are available in the two-player versus mode, which plays like the standard Mortal Kombat game, but instead on a 3D plane with horribly disfigured characters. The fighters aren't the only ones to show their faces. Many of the areas you'll encounter are very recognizable. The first stage takes place in Goro's lair, and when you emerge from there, you'll be at the bottom of the pit. Oh, and before I continue, if you haven't played any Mortal Kombat games, I might lose you when talking about stages, fatalities, characters, and the such. If you're already asking things like, what the hell is a Goro? You may want to play the first two games at a minimum before watching this in its entirety. Anyway, the pit stage is cool because uppercutting enemies off the bridge shows a small cutscene of the Onis becoming impaled on the spikes. It's just simple nostalgic things like this where the game actually shines. A small example of the other levels you'll find is the courtyard, which resembles the original game, the Netherrealm, that temple area with the spikes on the roof, and the acid pools. Each one looks and feels just like how you would expect it to. You also enter the hub of the game, simply called the portals. This area can be a pain in the ass because of those dark sorcerers, which will constantly be throwing spells your way. You also can't perform fatalities on them, which is really a pain. This layout is also a big maze, so it can be confusing to know which portal you need to enter. The game itself is fairly linear in nature, but you can do quite a bit of backtracking when you upgrade your skills. Basically, in the beginning you don't get very much. You learn special platforming skills such as long jump, pole swinging, double jump, and wall climbing. These skills are necessary to progress through the game, but also to find various unlockables in the form of yin-yang symbols. These symbols often just unlock concept art, which to me is a waste of time, but you can occasionally find things like health upgrades. There's even a few hidden battles if you know where to look, including one against Ermac that can be pretty frustrating if you're not heavy into blocking. Let's talk about the combat for a while. It's pretty standard. Square throws a quick attack that does moderate damage. Triangle uppercuts your enemy, launching them into the air and allowing for a pop-up combo. Circle executes a heavy hit, and if you hold it down you'll launch a more powerful strike. This attack can be used to make bosses slightly easier. All you need to do is jump and press circle and watch a chunk of the boss's life get taken away. It's incredibly effective and almost necessary when fighting Kintaro. Just be sure to jump away before he can grab you though. By pressing and holding the shoulder button, and the actual button actually escapes me, you'll enable a special attack. I've only played it through Kung Lao in this playthrough, so I can only explain his moves in depth, but in a nutshell, each character has a movement skill, launching skill, and a projectile. Kung Lao can teleport to near his enemy, do his whirlwind attack, and throw his hat. Each special move depletes a small bit of your special meter, and this meter replenishes naturally in a few seconds. These moves aren't entirely necessary to complete the game, but keeping an enemy in the air with the whirlwind attack can be awesome and extremely damaging. The hat throw is a bit weak, but it can be very helpful in keeping enemies far away, and also for keeping combos going. You must wait for the hat to come back onto his head before throwing it again, so it's not like you can spam the attack non-stop until the special meter is depleted. The teleportation is a bit on the useless side, so I barely used it. It just seems to warp you in a random spot, and not where you really want to go. Of course, you do get access to fatalities, and these are even split up into regular fatalities, multitalities, and brutalities. Multitalities are exactly what they sound like. They mutilate multiple opponents at one time. Brutalities are unlocked much further in the game. Instead of showing an animation, can instead get some super powerful and go around killing most enemies in about 3 hits. Performing regular fatalities will net you experience, but the others will not. Honestly, the fatalities are cool the first few times you watch them, but chances are you're not going to be finishing every enemy with one, as they do tend to start getting old after a while. In order to perform one of these, you need to attack enough enemies to fill up that orb at the top of the screen with blood. Once it's full, you press L1 to strike an enemy and bring up the fatality input screen. If you mess up, the enemy will just be a bit dizzy and you'll lose a bit of the sphere's blood, but it's easy to grow it back to where you want it to be. If you input the correct button combination, your character will be shown performing the inputted fatality. Liu Kang and Kung Lao each get about 8 fatalities, 2 multi-talities, and 1 brutality, but Scorpion and Sub-Zero only get about 4 regular fatalities and about the same amount of multis and brutals. The combat is pretty solid for the most part though, even with some of the quirky enemy patterns and attacks you have access to. One of the worst parts is the camera control. You can control it, barely. It's more of a shift than a control, as by using the right analog stick you can pan the camera to a few directions to kind of glance at your surroundings. It's hardly ever useful, and it would have been better if you were given free rein on rotating the scope of it. It's usually not a problem though, although sometimes enemies and environment may get in your way and it's a tad more difficult to orient yourself. One more thing about the combat and I'll move on. After defeating enemies, you'll earn experience, which is in turn obviously used to strengthen your special skills. The only problem is that it doesn't take very long to unlock everything. Most of the times, you'll have everything in your repertoire bought by the halfway point, leaving experience to be completely useless. This will especially be the case if you manage to kill enemies with high combo counts, as a higher count will allow you to get multipliers on the amount of experience you gain from defeated foes. Again, if you're good at maintaining combos, you'll have no problems maxing your competent quickly. Because of this, it would have been nice to see a few more things added in. After you get done fighting in each area, you move on to another screen. In certain crucial areas, cutscenes will play out, and unfortunately only a small handful are done in CGI that the intro was created in. Instead, most of the scenes are rendered with the game engine, leading to some awkward moments. In any case, these cutscenes don't look too bad overall, but the voice acting makes it feel like you're watching an old kung fu movie. The graphics in these scenes really show you how bland they could be though. Some of the characters look misshapen, such as Jax's huge chest. Blood looks pretty generic, especially during the fatality scenes that show out when you kill a boss. Speaking of boss fatalities, they are incredibly lame. You are forced to perform them to kill the boss, but oftentimes you're just sitting there thinking, is that it? You would have thought that the fatalities on the bosses would have been the best ones in the game, but they're not. This is especially true when defeating, or being defeated by, Shao Kahn. His hammer just hits you a few times, and that's it. For the final boss, you would normally be expecting a gigantic dismemberment or something, so it's pretty disappointing just to see a few weapon strikes. None of them really get any better though, so unfortunately, as a whole, fatalities are a pretty lame affair in this game. Speaking of Shao Kahn, he is indeed the final boss, but you do have to fight Shang Tsung and Gyutaro before him. What makes it worse is that you need to fight each of them consecutively with minimal health restoration. If you die at any time from here, you need to start at Shang Tsung again. This is incredibly frustrating, and this is even worse when you see that Shao Kahn is just as cheap as all the other Mortal Kombat games. It's best just to stick to the outside of the level and throw hats at him until he's defeated. Is this fun? Not in my book. But it's necessary to beat this fucker, and that's what I hate. Finally, in order to save your game, you need to get to the various holy statues that are lining the world. These checkpoints can be few and far between though. Thankfully, dying just puts you back at the beginning of the current room you're in, so you don't necessarily have to save it every chance you get. However, activating the statue does give you a health replenishment, so it's pretty helpful in that aspect alone. Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks isn't one of Midway's greatest efforts, but I'll tell you that it's definitely better than many of their other games. In fact, if you put it in line with many of the other beat-em-ups on the console, or even that era, it actually does a pretty good job of standing out. It could have been used maybe a bit more content and better fatalities, but for a game that'll take you about 6 hours or so, it's not too shabby. And if you're a Mortal Kombat fan, you definitely want to check this one out. As a bonus, you can unlock the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 2, which is even sweeter. It could have used a better versus mode, but in regards to the single player campaign, it's definitely enjoyable. Final score, 7 out of 10. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.